Once, not so very long ago, the world was a very different place. The great nations of Europe were like a forest of ancient trees, their roots and branches tangled together in a complex web of promises and rivalries. For many years, a fragile peace held, but beneath the surface, tensions were growing like a slow, deep rumble before a great storm. Countries were building bigger armies and newer, more powerful warships, each watching the other with a wary eye. This build-up of military might, a great arms race, made everyone feel a little less safe, a little more nervous. It was a time of great pride in one's own country, a feeling we call nationalism, but this pride often spilled over into suspicion of others. The continent of Europe was divided into two main groups, two great teams bound by treaties. On one side, we had the Triple Alliance, which included Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. They promised to protect each other if one was attacked. On the other side was the Triple Entente, a friendship between France, Russia and Great Britain. These alliances were meant to keep the peace, like a finely balanced scale. The thinking was that no country would dare to start a fight if it knew it would have to face several powerful enemies at once. But this delicate balance was more like a house of cards, ready to tumble with the slightest nudge. The nudge came on a sunny day in June 1914 in a city called Sarajevo. A handsome archduke named Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, was visiting the city with his wife, Sophie. As their car drove through the streets, a young man with a pistol stepped out from the crowd. His name was Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist who believed his people should be free from Austro-Hungarian rule. He fired 2 shots, and in that single shocking moment the archduke and his wife were gone. This act was the spark, the tiny flame that landed in a huge, dry pile of political gunpowder that had been accumulating for decades. This terrible event set off a chain reaction, a domino effect that no one seemed able to stop. Austria-Hungary, full of anger and grief, blamed the nearby country of Serbia for the assassination. They made a list of very harsh demands they knew Serbia could not possibly accept. When Serbia refused, Austria-Hungary declared war. Because of the tangled web of alliances, other countries were quickly pulled into the conflict. Russia, a friend to Serbia, began to get its army ready. Germany, seeing its ally Austria-Hungary threatened, declared war on Russia and then on Russia's friend, France. The dominoes were falling one after another, and the world was tumbling into a war unlike any it had ever seen before. With the first declarations of war, the great teams or alliances began to take their final shape for the conflict ahead. The Triple Entente, composed of France, Britain and Russia, became known as the Allied Powers. They were soon joined by other nations from around the globe, including Japan, Italy, which switched sides in 1915, and later the United States. These countries believed they were fighting to defend smaller nations and to stop the aggression of their rivals. On the other side stood the Central Powers, led by the formidable duo of Germany and Austria-Hungary. They were joined by the Ottoman Empire, a vast and ancient power in the Middle East, and later by Bulgaria. They felt they were encircled by enemies and were fighting for their very survival and place in the world. Each of these nations had its own reasons for entering the war, its own hopes and fears. Germany, a relatively new but powerful country, had a magnificent army and a growing industrial might. It dreamed of expanding its influence and colonies across the globe. France, on the other hand, still remembered its defeat in a previous war with Germany and longed to reclaim lost territories. Great Britain, with its vast overseas empire and the most powerful navy in the world, was worried about Germany's growing naval power and its potential threat to British trade routes. Britain entered the war when Germany invaded neutral Belgium, a small country whose safety Britain had promised to protect. Russia, the largest country of all, was like a sleeping giant. It had a massive army, often called the Russian steamroller, but it was poorly equipped, and its industries were not as developed as those in Western Europe. The Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, felt a deep connection to the Slavic people of Serbia and believed it was his duty to protect them from Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary itself was a patchwork empire, a collection of many different ethnic groups, and it feared that the rise of nationalism, especially from Serbia, would cause its fragile empire to break apart. The war for them was a desperate gamble to hold their diverse peoples together under one crown. So the stage was set. The main players had taken their positions, and their vast armies began to move across the continent. In the summer of 1914, millions of young men marched off to war, full of patriotic excitement. They were cheered on by crowds in the streets of London, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna. Most people believed the fighting would be over by Christmas, a short, sharp adventure. They could not have imagined the long, terrible years that lay ahead. They were marching into a new kind of warfare, one of industrial slaughter, for which no amount of training or courage could have truly prepared them. The world was holding its breath, unaware that it was on the brink of a conflict that would change it forever. The dream of a quick war vanished almost immediately. After the initial battles, the armies on the Western Front, the long line of fighting in France and Belgium, found that they could not advance. Both sides dug into the earth for protection, creating a vast and complex network of trenches. These were not just simple ditches, they were elaborate systems that stretched for nearly 500 miles from the coast of Belgium all the way to the border of Switzerland. There were frontline trenches where the fighting was most intense, and behind them were support trenches and reserve trenches, all connected by a maze of communication tunnels. This was to be the soldiers' home, their prison, and for so many, their final resting place. Life in these trenches was a miserable and terrifying existence. The first thing a soldier would notice was the mud. It was everywhere, a thick, sticky, foul-smelling soup that could suck the boots right off a man's feet. Heavy rain would turn the trenches into rivers of sludge, and soldiers would have to live, eat and sleep while being constantly wet and cold. This led to a painful condition called trench foot, where feet would become numb, swollen and sometimes so badly damaged they had to be amputated. The smell was another constant torment, a dreadful mix of overflowing latrines, rotting sandbags, stale food, unwashed bodies and the grim, sweet smell of death that hung heavy in the air. The days were a strange mixture of extreme boredom and sudden heart-pounding terror. For hours, soldiers might do nothing but wait, huddle against the damp earth, write letters home or try to sleep. But this quiet could be shattered in an instant by the scream of an incoming artillery shell. The constant threat of sniper fire meant that peeking over the top of the trench, over the parapet, was a death sentence. At night, the real work often began. Under the cover of darkness, patrols would venture out into no man's land, the deadly, shell-cratered strip of ground between the opposing trenches, to repair barbed wire, listen for enemy activity, or conduct surprise raids. Beyond the enemy soldiers, the men shared their wretched homes with other unwelcome residents. Millions of rats, grown fat on discarded food and the bodies of the fallen, scurried through the trenches, unafraid of the living. Lice were another plague, infesting the soldiers' clothing and causing a constant maddening itch and a sickness known as trench fever. Food was monotonous and often in short supply, typically consisting of hard biscuits, canned beef and jam. Clean water was scarce. Despite these horrific conditions, soldiers found ways to endure, forming deep bonds of friendship with their comrades, sharing dark jokes and dreaming of the day they might finally go home. While bullets and shells were the most obvious dangers, the soldiers in the trenches faced another, more insidious enemy disease. The crowded, unsanitary conditions were a perfect breeding ground for sickness to spread like wildfire. Simple infections that would be minor annoyances back home could become deadly in the mud of the front lines. Without proper medical facilities or antibiotics, a cut from barbed wire or shrapnel could easily become infected, leading to gangrene and amputation. The lack of clean water meant that diseases like dysentery and typhoid fever were rampant, weakening soldiers and making them more vulnerable to other illnesses. The constant stress and poor nutrition also took a heavy toll on their immune systems. In 1915, a terrifying new weapon was unleashed upon the battlefield: poison gas. First used by the Germans, it was a silent, creeping horror that drifted across no man's land on the wind. The first gases, like chlorine, caused a burning sensation in the throat and chest, leading to a slow and agonizing death by suffocation. Later, more sophisticated gases like phosgene and mustard gas were developed. Mustard gas was particularly cruel. It was almost odorless and caused terrible blisters on the skin, in the eyes and in the lungs. It could linger in the soil for weeks, making contaminated areas deadly long after an attack. Soldiers were soon issued with primitive gas masks, but these were often clumsy and unreliable, and the psychological terror of a gas attack never went away. The psychological wounds of the war were just as devastating as the physical ones. Many soldiers suffered from a condition that was then called shell shock, what we would today recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. The constant bombardment, the fear of death, and the horror of seeing friends killed or maimed had a profound effect on their minds. Some men became unable to speak or walk, while others were plagued by uncontrollable shaking, nightmares, and terrifying flashbacks. At the time, the condition was poorly understood, and many sufferers were unfairly accused of cowardice. It was another unseen wound, a deep scar on the minds of a generation of young men. Medical services struggled to cope with the sheer scale of the casualties. Brave stretcher bearers would venture into no man's land, often under heavy fire, to retrieve the wounded. They would be taken to casualty clearing stations just behind the lines, where exhausted doctors and nurses worked tirelessly in horrific conditions. They performed countless emergency surgeries, trying to save lives and limbs with limited supplies. For those who survived, the journey to a proper hospital far from the front was long and perilous. The medical advances made during the war, particularly in blood transfusions and plastic surgery, were remarkable, but they were born from an unprecedented level of human suffering. Of all the battles of the Great War, few are remembered with such sorrow as the Battle of the Somme. It began on the 1st of July 1916, a date now etched in history as one of the darkest days for the British Army. The plan, conceived by British and French commanders, was to launch a massive attack that would finally break through the German lines in northern France. For a full week before the attack, Allied artillery pounded the German trenches, firing over 1.5 million shells. The commanders believed this colossal bombardment would destroy the German barbed wire and wipe out the defenders, allowing the infantry to simply walk across no man's land and take the empty trenches. But the German soldiers were far from wiped out. They had built deep, reinforced concrete bunkers, some as much as 30 feet underground, where they were able to shelter from the storm of shells. When the bombardment finally stopped at 7:30 in the morning on that fateful day, the German machine gunners emerged from their underground shelters. They set up their guns and looked out across a no-man's land that was, to their astonishment, filled with lines of British soldiers, walking slowly towards them, heavily laden with equipment. The British commanders had ordered them to advance at a walking pace, believing there would be little resistance. The result was a slaughter on an industrial scale. The German machine guns opened fire, cutting down the advancing British soldiers in their thousands. The week-long bombardment had failed to cut much of the barbed wire, which now trapped the soldiers in the open, making them easy targets. Wave after wave of men went over the top of their trenches, only to be met with the same hail of bullets that had annihilated the wave before them. By the end of that single day, the British Army had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, with almost 20,000 of them killed. It remains the bloodiest day in the entire history of the British military. The Battle of the Somme did not end on that first terrible day. It would rage on for another 4.5 months, until November 1916. The fighting descended into a brutal war of attrition, with both sides throwing men and machines into the fray for tiny gains of muddy, shell-torn ground. The battle saw the first use of another new and terrifying weapon, the tank, but these early models were slow, clumsy, and unreliable, and they made little difference to the overall outcome. By the time the battle finally ended, the Allies had advanced only a few miles, at a cost of over 1 million casualties on all sides. The Somme became a symbol of the futility and tragic waste of trench warfare. For the first 3 years of the war, the United States of America remained on the sidelines. President Woodrow Wilson was re-elected in 1916 with the popular slogan, "He kept us out of war." The conflict was seen by many Americans as a European problem, a distant quarrel between old empires that had little to do with them. The country was a melting pot of immigrants from all the nations at war, including Britain, Germany, and Ireland, and choosing a side was a complicated matter. American businesses, however, were happy to trade with both sides, although a British naval blockade of Germany meant that trade with the Allies was much greater. This policy of neutrality was a source of great pride for many. However, events at sea began to slowly but surely pull America towards the conflict. Germany was using its submarines, known as U-boats, to sink ships that were heading to Britain, trying to starve the island nation into surrender. In May 1915, a German U-boat sank the British passenger liner, the Lusitania. Over 1,000 people died, including 128 Americans. This act caused outrage in the United States, but it was not enough to push the country into war. Germany, worried about provoking America, promised to stop sinking passenger ships without warning. For a time, it seemed that America might stay out of the war after all. The turning point came in early 1917. Germany, growing desperate to break the deadlock of the war, made a momentous decision. It announced that it would resume unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning its U-boats would now sink any ship, neutral or otherwise, found in the waters around Britain. The German leaders gambled that they could defeat Britain before the United States had time to raise, train, and transport an army to Europe. At the same time, a secret message from Germany to Mexico was intercepted by British intelligence. This message, known as the Zimmermann telegram, proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico if the United States entered the war, promising Mexico the return of its lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When the Zimmermann telegram was made public, the American people were furious. The combination of the renewed U-boat attacks on American ships and this audacious German plot against them was too much to bear. The mood of the country shifted dramatically from neutrality to a call for action. On April 6, 1917, President Wilson went before Congress and asked for a declaration of war, stating that the world must be made safe for democracy. The United States had finally entered the Great War. Its vast industrial power and fresh troops, known as doughboys, would tip the balance decisively in favor of the Allies. The year 1918 began with a race against time. For Germany, the situation was critical. The arrival of fresh American troops was imminent, and the British naval blockade was causing severe food and supply shortages back home. Russia had already left the war after the Bolshevik Revolution, which allowed Germany to move hundreds of thousands of its soldiers from the Eastern Front to the West. The German High Command knew they had one last chance to win the war before the Americans arrived in overwhelming numbers. They gathered their forces for a massive final gamble, a series of huge attacks known as the Spring Offensive. The German offensive began in March 1918 with terrifying force. Using new tactics, specially trained stormtroopers bypassed strong points and punched deep into the Allied lines, creating chaos and confusion. For the first time in years, the static trench lines were broken, and the war became one of movement again. The Germans made huge advances, pushing the British and French forces back dozens of miles. Panic began to set in on the Allied side, and for a few desperate weeks, it looked as though Germany might actually achieve the breakthrough they had sought for so long. Paris itself was once again threatened, with German artillery shelling the city from long range. But the German army had exhausted itself. The soldiers were weary after 4 years of war, and they had outrun their supply lines. The offensive, though initially successful, had cost them their best remaining troops. Just as the German push began to run out of steam, the American soldiers began to arrive in France in huge numbers, thousands every day. Bolstered by these fresh, enthusiastic troops and new tanks, the Allies launched a powerful counterattack in the summer of 1918. This campaign, known as the 100 Days Offensive, saw the Allies systematically push the Germans back, reclaiming all the territory that had been lost and more. The German army began to collapse. Its allies, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, were also being defeated on other fronts, and one by one they surrendered. At home in Germany, the people were starving and exhausted, and sailors in the navy began to mutiny, refusing to go on one last suicidal mission. The German Kaiser fled the country, and a new government was formed. Realizing the war was lost, this new government asked the Allies for an armistice, an agreement to stop the fighting. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns on the Western Front finally fell silent. The Great War was over. The end of the fighting did not mean an immediate end to the world's troubles. In 1919, the leaders of the victorious Allied nations gathered in France for the Paris Peace Conference. The main figures were the Big Four President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau of France, and Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando of Italy. They faced the monumental task of rebuilding a shattered world and trying to create a lasting peace. However, each leader came with different ideas. Wilson wanted a peace without victory, based on his idealistic 14 points, while Clemenceau, whose country had been devastated, wanted to punish Germany harshly to ensure it could never threaten France again. The result of their negotiations was the Treaty of Versailles, the peace treaty signed with Germany. The terms of the treaty were very severe. Germany was forced to accept full blame for starting the war in what was known as the War Guilt Clause. It had to pay enormous sums of money called reparations to the Allied countries to cover the costs of the war. Its army was drastically reduced in size, its navy was scuttled, and it was forbidden from having an air force. It also lost all of its overseas colonies and significant amounts of its own territory in Europe. For many Germans, the treaty was seen as a national humiliation, a diktat or dictated peace, which sowed seeds of bitterness and resentment. The war completely redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East. Four great empires that had dominated the world for centuries, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the Ottoman empires, were all gone. In their place, a host of new countries were created, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The principle of self-determination, the idea that people should be able to choose their own form of government, was applied, but not always fairly or consistently. This created new borders that often cut through existing ethnic groups, leading to new tensions and conflicts that would simmer for decades to come. One of President Wilson's most cherished ideas was the creation of a League of Nations. This was to be an international organization where countries could meet to solve their disputes through discussion and negotiation, rather than through war. It was a hopeful and revolutionary idea, a first attempt at global governance designed to prevent another catastrophe like the Great War. However, the League was weakened from the very beginning because the United States, in a stunning political reversal, refused to join it. Without the world's newest and most powerful nation as a member, the League of Nations struggled to enforce its decisions and ultimately failed to prevent the outbreak of another world war just 20 years later. The First World War left scars that were deeper than just the redrawn maps and fallen empires. The human cost was staggering and almost incomprehensible. An entire generation of young men, often called the Lost Generation, was decimated. Around 10 million soldiers were killed and another 20 million were wounded, many of them scarred for life, both physically and mentally. Every town and village across Europe had a memorial erected with a long list of names of those who never returned. The war also brought death to millions of civilians through starvation, disease, and military action, leaving a legacy of grief that would hang over families for years. The war also changed society in profound ways. With millions of men away at the front, women were called upon to fill their roles in factories, on farms, and in offices. They built shells, drove buses, and kept the countries running. This experience gave women a new sense of independence and capability, and in many countries their vital contribution to the war effort helped them to finally win the right to vote. The old social order with its rigid class structures was also shaken. The shared experience of the trenches, where men from all walks of life fought and died side by side, helped to break down some of the old barriers between the rich and the poor. The conflict accelerated technological and medical innovation at a breathtaking pace. The demands of the war led to rapid developments in aviation, with aeroplanes transforming from flimsy contraptions into sophisticated fighting machines. It spurred the development of tanks, submarines, and wireless communication. In medicine, the desperate need to treat vast numbers of casualties led to huge advances in surgery, blood transfusions, and the treatment of psychological trauma. These changes, born out of the necessity of conflict, would continue to shape the world long after the guns fell silent, paving the way for the modern technological age. Perhaps the most important echo of the Great War is its solemn warning to us all. It stands as a powerful reminder of how easily diplomacy can fail and how quickly nations can be swept up in a tide of nationalism and conflict. It teaches us about the terrible human cost of war and the importance of working together to maintain peace. The poppies that we wear to remember the fallen are not just a symbol of remembrance for those who died, but also a symbol of hope. A hope that we can learn from the lessons of the past and strive to build a world where such a devastating conflict can never happen again. The story of the Great War is a story of tragedy, but it is also a call to humanity to cherish peace above all else.
Right.